I think I like to think of myself as kind of like someone who learned from these amazing suffragists that I've studied and really believe in kind of emphasizing justice and social equality, especially, my interest is in gender equality, right?
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this episode of the First Amendment Museum's one-on-one interview series. I'm Max Nospish, the manager of visitor experiences here at the First Amendment Museum, located in Augusta, Maine. Today, I'm joined by our guest from down in Boston, Allison Lange. Allison, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Allison Lang, and I'm a professor at the Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston, very near the Museum of Fine Arts and Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, if you've ever been to that area. And I'm very excited to be here today.
Awesome, thank you. So, Allison, why do you think the First Amendment is important? What is its purpose?
The First Amendment is extremely important because it gives us a lot of opportunities to do things like have conversations or advocate for things that might be surprising to other people. I mean, as a suffrage historian, as someone who has studied women's voting rights, which is what suffrage means, voting rights. So having the access to the First Amendment to kind of guarantee the right to gather, the right to protest, the right to talk about these really controversial things is really crucial to the women's movement throughout much of our history.
So you wrote a book called Picturing Political Power, Images in the Women's Suffrage Movement. What is that about?
So that's about the fact that women's rights activists used images to really change how people were thinking about women in the United States, right? So just to kind of back up before they did that, a lot of images in American history really kind of celebrated white men with a lot of wealth as the most powerful, the most important political figures in American society. And women's rights activists really wanted to change that. And one of the reasons why they wanted to do that is they wanted people to think of them as powerful people too. They wanted people to believe that they were capable of doing things like voting and doing things beyond taking care of their families. So women's rights activists really worked hard to kind of portray themselves as leaders. I mean, one of the ones that a lot of us might be very familiar with is Susan B. Anthony, whose profile portrait has been on coins, a stamp, various things that we've encountered. She was one of the people very early on who really worked hard to portray women as leaders, and we still see a lot of the effects of that even today. And so my book is really about how these images in the past shaped how we thought about gender and power. And as you can guess, a lot of those things are still with us even in the 21st century.
How did women's voting rights activists use images to define things like gender and power?
So, for example, Sojourner Truth was one of the people to really work at this first. She sat for a variety of carte de visite portraits. I'm sure you have some at the museum, but for anyone who is not sure, they're really small. They're kind of like baseball card size photographs. And she was really conscious about portraying herself in a way that you wouldn't normally expect a freed Black woman to look. She looked very respectable. She looked very motherly, domestic, feminine. So she used those images to kind of shape the ways that people were thinking about her. She was a very famous anti-slavery activist, women's rights activist. She went around the country giving lectures and raising money for her causes by giving lectures. And so she used images like Frederick Douglass, who was one of her contemporaries, very much to kind of shape the way these people are thinking about her, challenge stereotypes. And so she really is one of the people who inspired Susan B. Anthony and others to do the same in the years that followed. And the reason why Sojourner Truth did that is because there were a lot of racist stereotypes, racist images that people were really regularly encountering. Similarly, there were a lot of sexist images that were really making fun of white women in the press. They're incredibly common. I cannot convey to you just how common they were. If you open up an illustrated newspaper from the 19th century, especially the mid-19th century, when it becomes really inexpensive to print images, and the women's rights movement is really becoming more powerful after the Seneca Falls meeting in 1848. You see a ton of cartoons making fun of these women's rights activists as mainly women. They're smoking, they're showing off their ankles, which doesn't sound like much today, but incredibly scandalous in the 1850s. They're going away from their families in order to go to a meeting. And that seems very cartoonish today, but at the time that seemed like a real threat to traditional American life. So when people like Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth and others were kind of trying to make a place for women, as leaders, as public figures, we celebrate them as important women in history today, but at the time they were seen as very threatening to that way of life.
So here at the museum online, we have a short history of political cartoons sort of online exhibition. So it has me wondering, what role did cartoons play in the debate over women's suffrage?
A very important role. Political cartoons were incredibly damaging for much of the 19th century for women's rights activists. They were, as I mentioned, like really cheap, easy to reproduce. People had them everywhere. They were like Courier and Ives prints. They made their own anti-women's rights prints. Illustrated newspaper, all the major ones, Harper's Weekly, Frank Leslie's, had plenty of illustrations making fun of women's rights activists. And so they were, very popular because they kind of created stereotypes about women, right? Like what women should be doing, what we should expect women to be doing in American society. And this changes, on a broad scale in the 1910s, really. That's when we start to see a lot of the major illustrated newspapers and newspapers in general kind of shift towards supporting suffrage. They see that the tide is changing. Places like New York State are passing women's suffrage, California. And so that's when the tide changes and we see fewer of these anti-women's rights cartoons. But I think that's an important thing to note, right? The 19th Amendment is ratified in 1920. It kind of follows not very long after we see this major turn in the ways that a lot of mainstream popular papers are portraying women. And that, is of course because of the work that suffragists are doing, because they by then have like press committees, they have publicity professionals, they have professional artists who are now female creating their own kind of challenges to those cartoons.
And how do you utilize the First Amendment in your everyday life?
Well, I think I like to think of myself as kind of like someone who learned from these amazing suffragists that I've studied and really believe in kind of emphasizing justice and social equality, especially, my interest is in gender equality, right? So this is something that I'd like to advocate in my personal life. I've been to marches, and that's, it's I think one of the things that I found really interesting was that the 2017 Women's March was just about like almost precisely a century after suffragists' very first picket of the White House. And, people picket the White House all the time in the 21st century. It's very common. We expect it when we go to DC. But they were the very first ones to do that. And I think that's kind of mind-blowing and surprising. And I think that, we have an expectation for ourselves as American citizens to be able to continue to do that sort of thing.
Allison, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have anything you want to promote, anything you want to plug, anything that you want to get out there? This is sort of your open mic moment.
Well, if you're interested in more about women suffragists and visual culture, my book, Picturing Political Power, is a great place to look. It has plenty more of the examples of the images that I'm referencing here. And my website is AllisonKLange.com. And I also have a great courses course specifically on women in American history. It follows 12 important women in American history and kind of gives you a background information about them and tells us how we got from, someone like Sacagawea to the much later Mary Church Terrell.